Welcome back to our lesson. I want to spend some time talking about what factors have contributed to the rapidly increasing overweight and obesity rates. Something that's important to understand is that the obesity epidemic is multifactorial, right? Sometimes it's easy to point fingers and say someone doesn't exercise, they don't eat well, so they're obese. Well, really, we have to think of it as this perfect storm of the health determinants: biology and genetics, individual behavior, social factors, public policy. They all work together to really create this epidemic. So I'm going to go through each of these health determinants here and take a look at how they are contributing to this epidemic. So first, biology and genetics. So we know there's a genetic component to body weight. Exactly what that is, we haven't quite figured out. That still remains in question. But we do know that overweight or obese parents tend to have overweight children. Okay, so there's a genetic influence. But I want to talk about the two types of obesity because it's important to understand that there's actually two different types. And if you look at the picture in the top right-hand corner, it kind of explains a little bit. So we have hyperplastic obesity, and we have hypertrophic obesity. So hyperplastic obesity refers to an excessive number of fat cells. So it's important to understand that you only develop fat cells up until the time you're done growing. So that's usually early to mid-20s, okay? So you develop fat cells up until you're done growing. Now, you develop them the most rapidly during times of growth. So fetal development, first year of life, around puberty. So developing too many fat cells leads to hyperplastic obesity. Okay, so we might think of that as kind of childhood obesity, having too many fat cells. Now, it's certainly possible for an adult who's done growing to gain or lose weight, right? That's because we can increase or decrease the size of our fat cells, okay, the fat cells that we do have. So in adulthood, we gain weight by increasing the size of fat cells. Now, this is why it is so difficult for an obese child to become a healthy weight adult, because when you are done growing, you cannot lose those fat cells. All you can do is change the size. So it's perfectly possible for someone to have both hyperplastic and hypertrophic obesity. So again, the best predictor of adult obesity is childhood obesity. We also have hormonal influence that play a role, specifically in hunger and weight gain. So we have two specific hormones called ghrelin and leptin. This might ring a bell to you. Some of you may have heard of this, but ghrelin is actually your hunger hormone. Okay, so maybe you're watching this and you haven't eaten a meal in a while and your stomach's kind of growling and your ghrelin is high and your ghrelin is telling you that you are hungry. Now, let's say after you watch this, you go and eat a nice lunch or dinner and your leptin goes down your ghrelin goes down and your leptin goes up, because leptin is your satiety hormone, okay? That just means it's your signal that you are full, okay, that you're satisfied. Now, here's the interesting thing about leptin. Leptin is actually produced by adipose tissue or produced by the fat cells. So people who are overweight or obese actually do have more leptin. So logically, we would think that when someone is overweight, they have more leptin, so they should know when they are full, right? But what happens is something called leptin resistance. So even though they have more leptin being produced by the fat tissues, those signals are not going to the brain to tell them that they are full. So it's much more difficult to control appetite because they're not feeling the satiety signals, okay, the fullness signals. So that makes it very, very difficult to control appetite, and it makes it very, very difficult then to lose weight, okay? So behavior is maybe the driving factor in this obesity epidemic. So starting with kind of the psychosocial, what does that mean? That means that sometimes we eat when we're not hungry. Why in the world would we eat if we're not physically hungry? Okay, there's so many reasons. One is we're stressed, right? One is we're bored. Maybe it's a social activity. Maybe we're happy and we're celebrating. But the point being that we often tie food back to our emotions. We often eat out of our emotions. That can create a very, very unhealthy relationship with food. Now, it's not always bad, right? If you're at a birthday party and have cake to celebrate, that's great. But when we're always tying food to our emotions, that's when it can become kind of an unhealthy coping mechanism and lead to weight gain. Another behavior is just the food that we consume. Okay, so there's been some changes in what we actually consume in this country. So this pie chart right here shows what we would call the standard American diet. And yes, the acronym is SAD, right? So if we look at this, we can see clearly what is wrong. The majority of the food that we eat are processed foods. Very little whole grains, very little fruits and vegetables and nuts and beans, a moderate amount of animal products, but the majority of our food is processed. There's so many reasons behind that. One is just convenience. It's available. There's so much fast food. We live a very, very high stress, convenience life. We like things quickly. And so we're often drawn to these things that are quick and easy and processed. I'm going to show you a quote. I think it's really interesting. And I hate to pick on the McDonald's chain, but they make themselves kind of an easy target sometimes. So I found this a few years ago and I thought it was fascinating. So part of McDonald's corporate mission is the goal of establishing enough outlets that Americans are never more than 4.5 minutes from the nearest franchise. Their goal is that every single one of us lives within 5 minutes of a McDonald's. Okay, and if we were in class right now, I'd ask you all to raise your hand, and probably the vast majority of you would say, yeah, I live within 5 minutes of McDonald's. They're doing a pretty quote-unquote good job of accomplishing this mission. The point being that food, especially processed food, is just so available to us. Our portion sizes have certainly changed. We actually eat the most per capita of any country, so almost 4,000 calories a day. So we eat the wrong things. We generally just eat too much. Physical activity. This has a lot to do with it, right? We're not moving enough, kind of starting with our youth. Sedentary activities like social media and video games and television have really replaced physical activity for our children. 26% of US children watch 4 or more hours of television a day. That doesn't include the time they're playing video games or any other leisure activity like a computer or sitting in school, right? That's just television. Our children are not moving enough. So how much activity should children be getting? If you said 60 minutes a day, you are correct. So we have got to get our kids moving, right? So 60 minutes a day of joyful movement. So kicking a soccer ball, riding on a scooter, throwing a football. You know, this doesn't mean I'm taking my 6-year-old and sticking him on a treadmill, right? But we want to get them moving because movement is actually a learned behavior. Just like we learn to read, we actually learn to move. It's called physical literacy. We have to teach our children this movement at a very, very young age. So 60 minutes a day is what we want our kids to do. All right, so how about adults? So how much exercise should adults be getting? If you said 150 minutes, you are correct. That is generally about 30 minutes a day, 5 times a week for a total of 150 minutes. We want people to move as much as possible. So this is kind of a minimum threshold of moderate intensity physical activity, but we want people to be moving as much as possible. We also, if you look at the very bottom line, want people to be doing 2 days a week of muscle strengthening activities. Sometimes we're pretty good at the aerobic activity, the walking, the jogging, the elliptical, but sometimes we neglect that 2 days a week of muscle strengthening. So why do we want to do that? The thing is that your metabolism is very dependent on your body composition and how much lean body mass you have. So the more muscle you have, the more calories you actually burn at rest. So having more muscle mass actually helps you maintain a healthy body weight because you're burning more calories when you're doing sedentary activities, okay? So are most Americans getting this 150 minutes? Well, we might be surprised that actually about 50% of Americans are sufficiently active. But what's really concerning is the far left-hand column here. 32% of US adults are completely inactive. Okay, and if you look at that bottom line there, that means less than 10 minutes of activity a week. So 32% completely inactive. A lot of that has to do with kind of the nature of our jobs. If you look at this, in the 1960s, almost half of our jobs actually included some kind of physical activity, right? So we're walking or we're moving in some sort, but those jobs have gone way down, whereas our light jobs and our very sedentary jobs have gone up. So again, we're just not moving in our jobs. Another thing to consider is that we're actually working more than ever before. The average work week used to be about 40 hours. Now it's about 47 hours. So not only are our jobs a lot more sedentary, but we're actually working a whole lot more. So we're just moving. This has been called kind of a sitting disease in our country. You may have heard the term sitting is the new smoking, but sitting is literally killing us. We spend so much of our day sitting that we've really got to find ways to be active, right? How do we incorporate physical activity in our daily life outside of our structured exercise, right? We want to exercise. We want to do that 30 minutes a day of moderate intensity activity, but we also want to be moving whenever possible. Okay, so we want to think about how to just increase our steps, increase our movement throughout the day. So another determinant that's impacting the obesity epidemic are social factors. Things like aggressive food marketing, right? So you see this all the time, right? Aggressive food marketing, food just being more available. We talked about that in terms of McDonald's and other fast food. How about poor social trends like binge drinking or our very technology-centered society? We've become a very sedentary society. This is an interesting quote on the screen. Genetics play a role in the obesity epidemic, but the gene pool in America has not changed significantly in a few decades during which obesity has become so prevalent. Genetics must be combined with an environment conducive to gaining weight. Again, the US really is that environment that's very, very conducive to weight gain, an obesogenic environment.